All right. So it looks like we're diving deep into Texas real estate today.
Yeah, it's quite the stack.
It is. It is. You must be pretty serious about getting into Texas real estate, maybe even becoming a license holder. So, in this deep dive,
We'll break down the essentials.
exactly, we'll highlight some of those surprising facts, maybe even a few aha moments.
Definitely a lot to unpack in this material.
For sure. And one of the things that jumped out at me right away was the different types of licenses. I kind of just assumed it was the salesperson license. But there are different levels for appraisers, too.
Uh-huh.
You got the licensed residential appraiser, certified residential appraiser.
And then a certified general appraiser.
Wow. So if you're thinking about specializing in appraisals, those are some important distinctions.
Absolutely. It can actually cost sellers thousands of dollars if the wrong method is used.
Thousands, really.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. So if I were a seller with a unique property, I'd want to make sure my appraiser was using the right approach. But before we get into all that, let's back up and talk about getting a real estate license in Texas.
All right. Sounds good.
What does it actually take?
Well, this study guide breaks down the required courses. It's not just selling houses. It covers a lot about the legal side, finance, and even the specific contracts used in Texas.
So it's pretty comprehensive.
Oh, yeah. Principles of real estate, INT, real estate finance, law of agency, law of contracts.
Oh, and promulgated contracts, right?
Right. Can't forget those.
Okay, so it's not just a quick weekend seminar or something.
We're having close.
The guide lays out different study plans, too. A 9-day crash course.
Yeah, for the super dedicated.
All the way up to a more relaxed 33-day plan.
So it really gives you a sense of the commitment involved.
For sure. And speaking of commitment, let's talk real estate math.
Ooh, that's a fun one.
I have to admit, when I saw real estate math, I kind of cringed.
I get it. I get it.
But why is it so important?
Well, when you're dealing with mortgages and commissions, property taxes, all those financial details, you really need a solid grasp of percentages, decimals, and just basic calculations.
Right, so if I'm explaining things like interest rates and closing costs to my clients, I need to actually understand it myself first, huh?
Exactly. And the guide goes into detail with those calculations, too.
Oh, does it give examples?
Absolutely. It gives you formulas and walks you through things like calculating total interest paid on a mortgage, figuring out property taxes.
That's actually super helpful.
And then it even covers how expenses are divided between buyers and sellers.
Do something called proration.
Proration, got it.
It even has this really interesting concept called a banker's year.
A banker's year. Okay, what is that?
Well, it's a simplification banks use, assuming a 360-day year with 12 months of 30 days each. Sounds a little strange.
That does sound a little strange.
But it actually comes in handy when you're dealing with things like daily interest charges.
So it's all about making the numbers work.
Okay, now let's move on to appraisals. This is a big one, especially if I'm thinking about becoming a licensed appraiser.
Absolutely crucial. The study guide really dives deep into the world of appraisals. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, what comes to mind when you hear the word appraisal?
I guess figuring out how much a property's worth. If I'm selling my house, I'd want to know what buyers would pay for it, right?
That's a great starting point. An appraisal is the professional opinion of a property's market value, and it plays a big role in mortgage approvals, property taxes,
Right.
all sorts of things. But it's not just slapping a price tag on a house.
Right. There's going to be a process for that, right?
There is. Appraisers use a really systematic process based on economic principles of value. They have to analyze market trends, determine how different factors influence the value of a property. For example, there's the principle of anticipation.
Okay.
That suggests that a property's value is influenced by future benefits it's expected to provide.
So if there's a rumor that a new shopping mall is being built nearby, that could increase the value because people anticipate the convenience and new stores and stuff.
Exactly. It's all about what buyers anticipate in the future. Then there's the principle of change. Properties and their surroundings are constantly evolving.
So like gentrification, right? As an area improves, property values tend to go up.
Precisely. And of course, the principle of conformity. Properties that blend in with their surroundings tend to hold their value better.
Makes sense. So it's not just about the house itself, it's the whole neighborhood.
It all plays a part. But to actually determine that value, there are three main approaches appraisers use.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, there's the sales comparison approach, looking at similar properties that have recently sold in the area, often called comps.
So comparing my house to others that have sold in the neighborhood.
Exactly. That's heavily reliant on market data and often used for residential properties. Then there's the cost approach. It estimates the cost to rebuild the property from scratch. Think about new construction or really unique property.
Right, where you can't really compare it to anything else.
Exactly. It's like figuring out how much it would cost to build a replica today, taking depreciation into account. And then the third approach is the income approach.
Okay.
This is commonly used for income-producing properties.
Like apartment buildings.
Exactly. It looks at how much income that property can generate and then uses that to estimate its value.
Makes sense. If it's generating a good amount of income, it's probably worth more. The guide also mentions this 8-step appraisal process. Sounds pretty involved.
It is, which highlights how important expertise is to be a good appraiser. It goes from defining the problem all the way to delivering the final report.
Okay, so appraisals are a big deal.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the world of mortgages. I remember when I was buying my first home, the mortgage process was like navigating a maze.
I hear you. There's so much to understand. All those different loan types, terms. We can start by clarifying those two markets, primary and secondary.
Oh yeah, that's where it starts getting confusing. So primary is where you actually go to get your loan. The banks, credit unions.
Exactly, where the mortgage originates. Then, those loans are often bundled together and sold on the secondary market to investors, frees up capital for those lenders to make more loans.
And that's where you get those big names like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
And Ginnie Mae, they're buying those mortgages, packaging them up into securities.
And then selling them to investors.
Exactly. Now, let's look at the different types of loans borrowers can get. The most common one, the amortized loan. You make regular payments over time that include both principal and interest.
So with each payment, I'm slowly chipping away at what I owe and gaining ownership, right?
That's right. You also have your adjustable rate mortgages, or ARMs, where the interest rate can fluctuate over time based on what's happening in the market.
Wait, so if interest rates go up, my monthly payments could increase.
They can, yeah, which is why they're usually better for people who plan to stay in their homes for a shorter time or are comfortable with a little more risk. But don't worry, there are government-backed loans like FHA and VA loans.
Right.
They're insured or guaranteed by the government.
That's a good option for first-time buyers or someone with lower credit score.
Exactly, makes them less risky for lenders.
Now, I remember when I applied for my first mortgage,
Yeah.
there was pre-qualification, pre-approval.
And final loan approval.
Yeah, the whole process felt a little drawn out.
I know what you mean. Pre-qualification, that's usually that initial chat with the lender to get a ballpark figure of how much you might be able to borrow. Not a guarantee, just a starting point.
So it's like testing the waters.
Exactly. Then pre-approval, that's more formal. The lender actually pulls your credit, verifies your finances.
And if you're pre-approved, you get that letter. That's pretty important when you're trying to show a seller you're serious.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows you're ready to move forward. And finally, of course, there's that final loan approval after they review everything.
Right, the appraisal, all the documents.
Right, and then you get the green light for closing.
Perfect. We've covered pre-qualification, pre-approval, final approval. What about all those other mortgage terms? I keep hearing about things like LTV and PMI.
Ah, yes, those are important ones. LTV, that's your loan-to-value ratio, the loan amount compared to the value of the house. So if you're borrowing $200,000 for a $250,000 house, your LTV would be 80%. The higher the LTV, usually the riskier it is for the lender.
I see. Which is where PMI comes in. I remember having to pay that with my first house.
Private mortgage insurance, right.
Yes.
Usually required for conventional loans when that LTV is above 80%.
Protects the lender.
That's right, just in case the borrower defaults.
Wait, so PMI protects the lender, but I'm the one paying for it?
It does seem a little unfair.
It does.
But that's how it works.
Yeah.
Allows buyers to buy with a smaller down payment.
Okay, that makes sense. What about buy-down mortgages? What are those?
Well, those are interesting. You pay a fee up front to temporarily reduce the interest rate. Could be a good option if you anticipate your income going up in the future. Helps you qualify for a larger loan now.
So it's like getting a head start on your mortgage payments.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
Okay, that's pretty clever. Now let's switch gears and talk about the legal side of things. Can be a little daunting, but important to understand,
Oh, absolutely.
especially if you're going to be a license holder.
For sure. And there are a few key pieces of legislation that have a huge impact on how real estate transactions are conducted. One is TILA Truth in Lending Act.
Okay, TILA, what's that all about?
TILA, and it's implementing Regulation Z.
Okay.
They protect you, the consumer, in credit transactions,
Okay.
requiring lenders to be clear and consistent about loan terms and costs.
So making sure I actually understand what I'm getting into.
Exactly. And then there's RPA, The Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, that protects consumers during the closing process
Fine.
by setting requirements for those disclosures, prohibits certain kickbacks, and ensures you understand all those closing costs.
So it's all about fairness and transparency. What about the 3-day right of rescission?
Yes, that's a key part of TILA. Gives borrowers a 3-day window to back out of certain credit transactions,
Okay.
especially those involving their primary residence, a really valuable protection.
That's good to know. Now, what about advertising? Are there any rules on how you can advertise mortgage terms?
Oh, absolutely. Regulation Z has strict rules. Lenders can't just throw any numbers out there. It all has to be clear, accurate, and not misleading to consumers. Transparency is really key.
So, no bait and switch tactics. What about my credit report? That's important when applying for a mortgage, right? What are my rights there?
That's where the Fair Credit Reporting Act comes in.
SCRA.
That's the one. Protects your rights when it comes to your credit report. Applies to both buyers and property managers.
So as a buyer, I need to know what's on my report and how it might affect getting a loan. And as a property manager, I need to know the procedures for pulling credit reports on potential tenants.
Exactly. It's all about fairness and accuracy.
Got it. Now let's move on to land use, ownership, and environmental concerns. Seems like that's getting more important these days.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about buying and selling properties anymore.
There are so many rules and regulations, environmental regulations, land use restrictions.
It does add a whole new layer of complexity.
It does.
So the guide breaks down the different types of land use controls, starting with public ones. Those come from the government zoning ordinances, building codes, and subdivision regulations.
Right, so zoning designates certain areas for certain uses, like residential, commercial, industrial,
Helps ensure development happens in a planned way.
and then building codes, those set the minimum standards for construction, right? For safety and stuff like that.
Exactly. And subdivision regulations, they govern how you divide land into those smaller lots.
So a lot of rules controlling how land's used and developed. What about private land use controls? Those are things like HOA rules.
HOAs are one example, yeah. A lot of times they're deed restrictions, limitations on how a property can be used, often put in place by developers.
To control what the neighborhood looks like.
Exactly. Can cover anything from fences to how many pets you're allowed.
So they can get pretty specific.
They can. Now, when it comes to ownership, a couple key concepts to understand. First, eminent domain.
Okay.
This is the government's right to take private property for public use, even if the owner doesn't want to sell.
I've always thought that was a little controversial.
It can be, yeah, it can be. But it is rooted in the Constitution, and they are required to pay fair compensation for any property they take.
Okay, so the government has to pay a fair price if they take your land. What about a sheet? What happens if someone dies without a will and no heirs?
That's where SCHIC comes in. That property reverts to the state.
I see, so the state has a safety net
That's right.
to handle those situations. This guide also mentions the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. What's that about?
Well, that protects buyers when they're purchasing land in interstate commerce. Basically, it requires developers to register those subdivisions and give potential buyers a detailed property report before they sign anything.
So making sure they're informed.
Exactly. Distance to nearby communities, utilities, any encumbrances on the property.
So it's more than just pretty pictures in a brochure.
That's right.
They need to know the real details.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered land use and ownership. Now let's talk about environmental concerns. Seems like there are more and more of those to worry about in real estate.
Absolutely. And this study guide highlights a few that every license holder should be aware of, especially when dealing with older properties.
Asbestos, lead paint, right?
Those are big ones, and they can be really common in homes built before certain years.
And they can both cause serious health issues.
Exactly. With asbestos, if it's present, it needs to be properly abated by a qualified professional. Lead paint is a major concern, especially for children.
So if I'm representing a buyer, especially for an older home, I should always advise them to get it tested for those things.
Absolutely. Don't forget radon, too.
Radon, right.
It can seep into homes from the ground.
And you can't even smell it.
Nope. Completely odorless.
But it can cause health issues.
Exactly. Testing for that is always a good idea.
Okay, so it's not just the stuff you can see. There are hidden dangers, too.
Absolutely. And then there are those underground storage tanks, or USTs.
Okay.
They can leak and contaminate groundwater. Big concern if a property had commercial or industrial use in the past.
So like a property that used to be a gas station.
Exactly.
Got it. And mold. of course.
Of course, can cause health problems and damage the property.
And you always have to be on the lookout for water damage.
Absolutely. Moist environments are a breeding ground for mold.
Okay, so asbestos, lead paint, radon, USTs, and mold. A lot to keep track of, but really crucial to be aware of these things. Protect yourself and your clients.
Absolutely. It's your responsibility as a license holder to be knowledgeable and advise your clients accordingly. Now, here's something you might not know. Texas actually owns quite a bit of public land.
Really? I thought most of the land in Texas was privately owned.
Well, 95% is. That's 3 times more than any other state.
Wow, that's a lot of private land.
It is, but the state actually owns around 22.5 million acres.
Wow. I had no idea. So much to learn about Texas.
There is.
All right, let's dive into the world of leases and property management. Seems like a whole specialty area within real estate.
Definitely is, and it offers a lot of opportunity if you're interested in those day-to-day operations. So when you think of a lease, what comes to mind?
Well, I know it's a contract between the landlord and a tenant that sets the terms for using the property, how much the rent is, when it's due, things like that.
Exactly. That's a great starting point. And this study guide highlights some key elements that must be there for it to be a valid lease.
So it has to clearly state who the landlord and tenant are.
Absolutely. Also, the description of the property, how long the lease is for, the amount of rent. And here in Texas, any lease longer than a year has to be in writing to be enforceable.
Oh, so verbal agreements are okay for shorter leases?
Yeah, but anything longer, got to be in writing to avoid misunderstandings.
Makes sense. What about the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants? Those can be tricky.
Definitely can be. It's a two-way street, right? Landlords need to provide a safe and habitable place. Tenants need to pay rent on time and take care of the property.
Right.
All of that's spelled out in the Texas Property Code. Security deposits, repairs, maintenance,
Even eviction.
all of it.
Yeah.
A really comprehensive set of rules everyone needs to be aware of.
So there are a lot of rules for both landlords and tenants.
Absolutely. Now, what about those different types of leases? You've heard of things like gross leases and net leases.
I have, but I'm not really sure what the difference is.
It's a good question. Understanding the different types is crucial in real estate. We can start with the gross lease. That's common for residential.
All right, tell me about those.
So with a gross lease, the tenant pays a fixed rent amount and the landlord covers those operating expenses like the taxes, insurance, maintenance.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. Then you have your net leases, more common in commercial real estate.
Okay.
There, the tenant pays a base rent, but also some or all of the operating expenses.
So the tenant might be responsible for property taxes or even maintenance.
It depends on the specific terms, but that's the idea.
So they take on more of the responsibility like they own the property.
That's one way to look at it. There are even variations like the double net and triple net leases where the tenant takes on even more.
So with a triple net, the tenant's responsible for almost everything except the mortgage.
Pretty much. And then you have those percentage leases, often used for retail.
Okay, so the rent is a percentage of the sales.
Exactly. Aligns the interests of the landlord and tenant.
Interesting. So if the business does well, everyone benefits.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the role of a property manager. What do you think of when you hear that term?
Someone who handles all the day-to-day stuff for a property. Finding tenants, collecting rent, dealing with those repair issues.
That's a great summary. Whether it's a single-family home or a big apartment building, even commercial properties.
So they're the go-between for the owner and the tenants.
That's a good way to put it. In Texas, if they're involved in leasing, they're required to have a real estate license.
Which is a pretty serious job.
Oh, yeah. It requires expertise, a good understanding of the law.
Right. It's more than just fixing a leaky faucet.
Exactly.
Now, are there different specializations within property management?
That's a great question. Property management can be a great specialization for people who enjoy working with both people and properties. You can even manage vacation rentals, specialize in commercial properties.
Sounds like a dynamic field. Now, I know a lot of people are interested in real estate investments.
Uh-huh.
Is that something this guide covers?
It does. It gives you a good overview of those investment objectives.
Okay.
Income or cash flow, appreciation, even tax benefits.
So let's break those down. Income or cash flow. What's that all about?
It's pretty much what it sounds like. Investors are looking for properties where that rental income is more than their expenses, so they're making money each month.
Passive income.
Exactly. Then you have appreciation. That's the increase in value over time.
So buy low, sell high.
That's the hope. And of course, real estate has those unique tax benefits.
Okay.
Deductions for expenses, depreciation, and even capital gains deferrals. with things like 1031 exchanges.
Wow, so there are a lot of financial benefits that are hard to find elsewhere. But there are risks too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme or anything. Liquidity is one of the biggest challenges. It's not like stocks where you can quickly cash out.
So you need to have a longer-term outlook.
For sure.
Yeah.
And there's always the risk of those market fluctuations. Property values could drop. You could have a difficult tenant.
All valid concerns.
They are. Real estate investing requires research, due diligence, and just being ready for the ups and downs.
Okay, so it's not for the faint of heart.
No, but if you do your homework, it can be incredibly rewarding.
Now, when you're analyzing a potential investment property, are there any key numbers to look for?
Definitely. The guide talks about potential gross income, or PGI,
Okay.
effective gross income, or EGI, and net operating income, or NOI.
All right, break those down for me.
PGI is the total potential rental income if every unit was occupied at market rent.
Okay, so ideal scenario.
Exactly, but there's always going to be some vacancy, which is where EGI comes in.
Yeah.
It's more realistic. It includes things like laundry fees or parking income.
Okay, and then NOI.
NOI is your EGI minus those operating expenses.
So like property taxes, insurance, maintenance.
Exactly. And that NOI is crucial for investors. It reflects the profitability. It's the bottom line.
So the higher the NOI, the better.
Generally, yes, but you also have to consider things like location, the condition of the property, the overall market.
It's not just about chasing the highest number.
Exactly. Now, the guide also mentions these unique investment vehicles called REITs, real estate investment trusts, and RIMICs, which are real estate mortgage investment conduits.
Okay, REITs, those are like mutual funds for real estate, right?
That's a good way to think about it. Companies that own and operate income-producing real estate.
So instead of buying a whole apartment building, I could buy shares in a REIT that owns a bunch.
Exactly. They even have to distribute 90% of their taxable income to shareholders as dividends.
Oh, so they're good for passive income.
Right. RIMICs are a little more complex. They're special purpose vehicles that hold pools of mortgages and issue those mortgage-backed securities to investors.
So instead of investing in a specific property, you're investing in a bunch of mortgages.
Exactly. Think of it like a tiny slice of many mortgages. A little more high risk, high reward.
Okay, so REITs are like mutual funds for real estate, and REMICs are like owning a little piece of many mortgages.
You got it.
Okay, what about these real estate investment syndicates I see mentioned?
Yes. Syndicates are groups of investors who pool their money to buy and manage properties.
So it's a team effort to take on bigger projects.
Exactly. Allows people to participate in deals they might not be able to afford on their own.
Okay, so if I wanted to invest in a big office building, I could join a syndicate and pool my money with others.
That's the idea.
Interesting. This study guide is full of great information about Texas real estate.
Definitely covers all the bases. And it's important to remember that a lot of this knowledge is tested on the licensing exam.
It is.
So soaking up this information is going to help you pass.
For sure. Speaking of the exam, it also highlights something called competency policy and scope of authority, emphasizing specialization.
It's a great point. You can't be an expert in everything, right?
Right. It's best to find your niche.
Exactly. Whether it's residential sales, commercial leasing, property management, appraisals.
And the Texas Real Estate Commission, or DRC, has those rules in place to make sure you're practicing in your area of competence.
Absolutely. It's all about protecting the consumer and maintaining the integrity of the industry. So if you're thinking about that license, start thinking about what area of real estate really calls to you. What do you see yourself specializing in?
That's great advice. So much to think about.
It is.
All right, I think it's time to dive into some real estate math calculations.
Sounds good to me. All right, so let's dive into some real estate math calculations now. Don't worry, we're not going to bore you with a bunch of complicated formulas or anything. We'll focus on the practical side. You know how these calculations actually work in the real world.
Yeah, way better than my high school algebra class, that's for sure.
Exactly. So what kind of calculations are we talking about here? Well, it starts with the basics, like figuring out the area of a property.
Right, square footage, acreage.
That's it. Those are fundamental no matter what kind of property you're dealing with. You need to understand those dimensions.
Whether it's a tiny studio apartment or a sprawling ranch.
Exactly. And the guide even shows you how to calculate the area of those irregularly shaped lots. Those can get a little tricky.
Oh yeah, those odd shapes can definitely throw you for a loop.
They can. But once you've got that down, you can move on to property valuation.
Okay.
And this study guide actually covers several methods for estimating a property's value. One that real estate agents use all the time is the CMA, the comparative market analysis.
CMA. Yeah, that rings a bell. Isn't that how agents figure out the listing price?
That's it. Finding those comps, those comparable properties, and making adjustments based on the unique features of the house you're trying to value.
So if I want to know what my house is worth, I'd look at what similar houses in my neighborhood have sold for recently.
Exactly. You'd adjust for things like square footage, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, the age, any upgrades.
So it's all about comparing apples to apples, or I guess houses to houses in this case.
That's a good way to put it. We also talked earlier about the NOI, the net operating income for investment properties, and that plays a role in determining value too.
Right. A property with a higher NOI is generally considered more valuable.
That's right. And for commercial properties, the study guide introduces this concept called cap rate, or the capitalization rate. That estimates the rate of return an investor can expect on a property based on its NOI.
So a higher cap rate means a better return on investment.
Generally, yes. But remember, risk is a factor too. A higher cap rate often comes with more risk. There are also those gross rent multipliers and gross income multipliers.
Yeah, I've heard those terms thrown around.
Those are kind of quick and dirty ways to estimate value. Not as precise, but can be helpful for a ballpark figure.
So if I know the monthly rent, I could use the gross rent multiplier to guesstimate the value.
Exactly. Now, when you hear the word equity in real estate, what comes to mind?
For me, it's the portion of my house that I actually own, not what I still owe on the mortgage.
That's a perfect explanation. It's the difference between the market value and how much you still owe. So as you make those mortgage payments, your equity grows.
It's like slowly building ownership over time.
Exactly. Now, this study guide also gives you a really detailed breakdown of what to expect on the Texas Real Estate Salesperson pre-license exam.
I saw that. It's pretty intimidating.
It's a lot of information, that's for sure. Covers everything from real property characteristics and those legal descriptions to contracts, agency, financing, disclosures, and of course the math we were just talking about.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures. I actually need to understand it.
Right. You need to know how to apply it to real-world scenarios. And the guide helps you out. It breaks down the exam into categories and even tells you how many questions from each area to expect.
Wow. So I know exactly what's coming.
Pretty much. For example, both the salesperson and broker exams dedicate 9 questions to real property characteristics, legal descriptions, and property use.
9 questions on that. Okay.
Yeah.
What else is a big focus?
Contracts and agency take up a big chunk. 16 questions for salespersons, 17 for brokers.
Okay. So knowing the legal and ethical side is super important. What about Texas-specific stuff? Is that on there too?
Absolutely. There's a whole section dedicated to state-specific content. Things like the Texas Real Estate Commission, rules for real estate professionals, Texas license law.
How many questions on that?
30 scored items, so it's a pretty big portion.
30? Okay, that's a lot. So what kind of topics?
Well, you'll find things about community property, homestead protections, the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, and even landlord-tenant issues.
Okay, Texas law is definitely unique.
It is. It is. Now, the guide also has some study tips and schedules.
Oh, does it? Like what?
Well, they have a 9-day crash course, a 13-day plan, and a 33-day plan.
So something for everyone.
Exactly. Whether you like to cram or prefer to take your time.
What's that crash course like?
Pretty intense. You're covering a lot in a short time, so lots of study hours.
And the 33-day plan is for those who like to pace themselves.
Exactly. There's even a create your own study plan option if you want to tailor it to how you learn best.
Oh, that's cool. Lots of flexibility.
There is. And don't forget that progress tracker. It can help you stay on track and make sure you're covering everything.
Oh, yeah. That's helpful for accountability.
It is. It's all about being organized and having a plan. Speaking of plans, let's shift gears and talk about the role of the broker in all of this.
Okay, so we've talked about getting licensed, but what about finding a broker to work with?
Ah, yes, the broker. Well, in Texas, if you want to do anything in real estate brokerage, like listing and selling, representing buyers and sellers, you have to be licensed as a broker.
So even if I get my salesperson license, I still need to work under a broker.
That's right. Brokers have a ton of responsibilities.
Okay, like what?
Supervising sales agents, ensuring compliance with the law, managing trust funds.
Wow, sounds like a big job.
Oh, it is. They're essentially the backbone of the industry.
So finding a good broker is pretty important.
It is. And a study guide emphasizes that brokers need to practice within their own scope of expertise, just like individual agents. They can't just dabble in everything, gotta have the knowledge and experience.
Makes sense. It's all about protecting those consumers.
Right. Got to maintain that industry integrity. The study guide also talks about the unauthorized practice of law.
What's that all about?
Well, brokers can't start giving out legal advice or drafting legal documents. That's for attorneys to handle.
So they have to know their limits.
They do. Know when to call in the experts. Now, what about brokerage agreements?
Those are the contracts between a broker and their client, right?
Mm.
The buyer, seller, whoever they're representing.
That's right. And they lay out the terms, what the broker is going to do for the client, and how they get paid.
So it's all in writing, no funny business.
Exactly. And the study guide highlights some key elements in those agreements: the duration, the scope of the broker's authority, the commission structure.
Okay, so it's all spelled out to avoid those misunderstandings.
That's the goal. And there are a few different types of brokerage agreements.
Like what?
You've got your exclusive right to sell listings, exclusive agency listings, open listings, net listings.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. An exclusive right to sell listing is the most common. That gives the broker the exclusive right to sell that property, no matter who finds the buyer.
So even if I find a buyer on my own, the broker still gets paid.
That's right. Then you have the exclusive agency listing, similar, but the seller can still sell the property on their own without paying a commission.
So the broker only gets paid if they bring the buyer.
Exactly. Then you have open listings where the seller can work with multiple brokers, and whoever brings the buyer wins the commission.
Sounds like a race to the finish line.
It kind of is. And lastly, you have the net listing. Not very common, generally discouraged here in Texas. The seller sets a minimum price, and the broker gets to keep anything above that.
So they sell it for way more than that minimum. They could get a huge commission.
They could, which is why it can be problematic.
Yeah, sounds like a potential conflict of interest.
Exactly.
So the right listing agreement depends on the client's needs, and the broker always needs to act in their best interest. What about fair housing laws? Those are pretty important to real estate, right?
They are. That Fair Housing Act is really a cornerstone of the industry. It prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, or disability.
So everyone deserves a fair shot at housing.
Absolutely. And the guide gives examples of practices that violate those laws.
Like what?
Well, there's steering. That's when you direct people to certain neighborhoods based on their protected class.
So, like, limiting their choices based on their race.
Exactly. That's a big no-no. Then you have blockbusting.
Okay.
That's inducing panic selling in a neighborhood by suggesting people of a certain group are moving in.
While preying on those fears.
Absolutely illegal. And then redlining, denying loans or insurance to people based on their race or ethnicity, not their qualifications.
Those are serious offenses.
They are. And the Fair Housing Act has real teeth, with consequences for those violations.
Okay, good to know. What about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act? Does that apply to real estate?
It does. It prohibits discrimination against those with disabilities.
So everyone has equal access to housing.
Exactly. Newly constructed public accommodations and commercial buildings have to be accessible.
Okay.
And even existing facilities are required to make reasonable accommodations.
So I need to be aware of those requirements and make sure any properties I'm listing or managing comply with the ADA.
Absolutely. Accessibility is a big deal in real estate these days.
Got it. Now, this guide mentions risk management for brokers. Pretty crucial for a successful brokerage, I'd imagine.
It really is. One of the biggest risks they face is related to supervision. Got to make sure those sales agents are following the law and being ethical.
So it's not just hiring agents and letting them do their thing.
Not at all. You have to provide oversight.
Right.
And there's this concept called vicarious liability. Basically, the broker can be held responsible for their agent's actions, even if they didn't directly do anything wrong.
Wow, so the broker is ultimately responsible.
They are, which is why having a strong supervisory system is so important.
Okay, supervision is key. What other risks are out there?
Well, the guide talks about antitrust laws. Those prevent monopolies and keep the marketplace competitive.
How does that apply to real estate?
Well, there are things real estate professionals have to avoid, like price fixing
Okay.
and market allocation.
What
Price fixing is when competing brokers agree to set commission rates or fees instead of letting the market determine them. Market allocation is when they divide a market, each focusing on a specific area or type of property.
So they're like carving up the pie and stifling competition.
Exactly. Both of those are illegal. And then there's fraud and misrepresentation. Those are serious ethical violations.
Right, those can even lead to criminal charges.
They can.
So always be honest with clients, don't make any false statements, and always act with integrity.
That's it. Integrity is everything in this industry.
Integrity, no price fixing, no market allocation, no fraud. Got it. What about insurance? Can that help protect brokers and agents?
There are a couple of key types. E&O insurance, that's errors and omissions,
Okay.
protects you if you make a mistake or are negligent in your professional services.
So if I accidentally give a client bad advice, E&O insurance can help.
That's the idea. And then general liability insurance covers things like injuries or property damage.
So if someone trips and falls at my open house, general liability can help.
Exactly. But remember, those policies are a safety net, not a substitute for doing things the right way.
Right. Got to be ethical and competent.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about property disclosures.
Okay.
It's all about transparency between buyers and sellers. In Texas, sellers have to tell potential buyers about any known problem.
So leaky roof, foundation problems, they have to come clean about all that.
That's right. There's a specific form, the seller's disclosure notice,
Okay.
and it covers everything: structural issues, environmental hazards, previous repairs.
Some pretty comprehensive document.
It is. And buyers should also do their own research, hire inspectors.
So both sides have to be proactive.
Absolutely. Remember all those environmental issues we talked about?
Asbestos, lead paint, radon. Yeah, definitely don't want to forget about those.
Those are all things that should be on the seller's disclosure notice, and buyers should consider those specialized inspections for those things, especially with older homes.
Knowledge is power.
It is. Now, there are also environmental regulations that impact transactions.
Like what?
Well, there's CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act.
Okay, Circle. That's a mouthful. What's that all about?
Well, it's about cleaning up hazardous waste sites. Can get pretty complicated, but basically it makes the people responsible for contaminating a site liable for cleaning it up.
Even if it happened before they owned the property.
That's right. So if there's a chance of contamination, it's crucial to get legal advice and make sure the property is properly assessed and cleaned up.
Okay. Sounds like environmental issues are a serious matter in real estate.
They definitely are. Now, let's get back to financing for a minute.
Okay.
We talked about the different loan types, but the legal side is important too.
Right.
This study guide mentions the EEOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Prevents discrimination in lending based on things like race, religion, gender.
Right. Equal opportunity for everyone.
Exactly. Everyone deserves a fair chance. It also mentions mortgage fraud, which is a serious crime.
What are some examples of mortgage fraud?
Well, it could be anything from lying on a loan application to inflating a property's value using straw buyers.
So it's all about deceiving lenders to get a loan you wouldn't normally qualify for.
That's right. And then there's predatory lending,
Okay.
using deceptive or unfair tactics to get borrowers into loans they can't afford.
Taking advantage of people who are struggling.
Exactly. Be aware of the signs, and if you see something suspicious, report it.
Got it. Now, what about closing? I know that's the final stage.
That's it, the moment of truth. The study guide gives you a good overview of what to expect, from preparing all those documents to dispersing the funds.
It can be pretty complex.
It can. Lots of moving parts. You have your closing agent, usually a title company rep or an attorney. They're the ones making sure everything runs smoothly.
So they're kind of like the conductor of the whole thing.
That's a good way to put it. And RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, that's a key piece of legislation here.
Okay, remind me what RESPA does again.
Well, it's all about protecting consumers during that closing process. Requires clear disclosures about those closing costs, prohibits certain kickbacks and referral fees that could drive up those costs.
So RESPA is looking out for me, the buyer.
That's right. One of the key requirements is the closing disclosure. That document lists all the costs involved.
So it's itemized, like a receipt.
Exactly. And you get that at least 3 business days before closing, giving you time to review everything.
So no surprises at the last minute.
That's the goal. RESPA also prohibits kickbacks or referral fees between settlement service providers.
So like lenders, title companies, real estate agents, they can't pay each other under the table for referrals.
Exactly. It's all about keeping things ethical.
Okay, good to know. Now, what about all those costs at closing? Are there any that tend to catch people off guard?
Well, the study guide breaks down the typical costs, things like the broker's commission, attorney fees, appraisal fees, escrow fees, the buyer's earnest money.
Okay, let's start with the commission. Who pays that and how much is it?
Typically the biggest expense, and it's paid by the seller. It's a percentage of the sales price,
Right.
negotiated between the seller and the broker.
Okay. What about attorney fees?
Usually paid by the seller, too, covers things like preparing the deed,
Okay.
making sure everything is legally sound.
And appraisal fees, I remember paying those.
Those are typically paid by the buyer to have that professional appraisal done.
Okay, and escrow fees.
Paid to the closing agent for handling the whole closing process.
Okay, and my earnest money, that goes towards the purchase price.
Exactly. It's credited to the buyer at closing.
So a lot of costs involved, but at least we know what they are now. Now, what about the steps to actually get my license? The study guide outlines those, right?
It does, starting with the educational requirements. To be a licensed real estate agent in Texas, you have to complete 180 hours of pre-licensing courses.
180, that's like a part-time job.
It's a commitment for sure, but those courses cover a lot of ground.
Like what?
Well, principles of real estate, finance, law of agency, contracts, and those promulgated contracts we talked about earlier.
Okay, so once I've done the courses, then what?
Then it's exam time.
The big one.
It is, but don't worry, the study guide has your back. The exam is administered by Pearson VUE, and it has a national and a state-specific section. To even take it, you have to apply to the Texas Real Estate Commission, or TS, and pass a background check.
Okay, so education, exam, application, background check.
That's the process.
What happens after I pass the exam? Do I get my license then?
Almost. You have to find a sponsoring broker and activate your license.
Oh, right. I can't just go off and work on my
Or
own.
you need a broker to sponsor you. Until then, your license is inactive.
Okay, finding a good broker is crucial.
It is. Now, the study guide also suggests some study schedules.
Okay, like what?
They have a 9-day, a 13-day, and a 33-day plan.
9 days. I don't know if I could do it that quickly.
It's definitely a crash course.
And the 33-day plans for those who like to spread it out.
Exactly. You can also create your own plan if you prefer.
Oh, that's cool.
It is. And don't forget that progress tracker. Keeps you accountable, helps you stay on track.
Accountability is good. Now, what about the whole concept of title in real estate? I always hear that word, but I'm not sure I completely understand it.
Title. It's super important in real estate law. Basically, it refers to the ownership of a property,
Okay.
including all the rights and privileges that come with it.
So it's the proof that I actually own the property.
Exactly. And the guide emphasizes how important it is to have a clear title, meaning there are no issues or encumbrances.
Okay, so what could cause a problem with the title?
Liaisons, easements, boundary disputes, those can all muddy the waters.
So how do I make sure I have a clear title when buying property?
Title insurance. That protects buyers and lenders against losses from title defects.
So it's kind of like a safety net, just in case.
That's a good way to put it. The guide also talks about recording the title. Remember that?
Yeah, vaguely. It's about making it public record, right?
You got it. In Texas, deeds, mortgages, those things are recorded in the county clerk's office.
Right, so everyone knows who has an interest in the property.
Exactly. Protects your ownership and prevents someone else from claiming it as theirs.
Okay, so recording is all about protecting my claim. What's this notice concept?
Notice. Bit of a legal technicality, but it's important.
Okay, break it down for me.
Basically, it means you're considered aware of certain information, even if you don't actually know it.
Wait, how can I be responsible for something I don't know?
Well, there's actual notice. That's when you have direct knowledge. And then there's constructive notice.
Okay.
That's when it's publicly recorded. So you're deemed to know, even if you haven't personally seen it.
So if a deed's recorded at the county clerk's office, I'm supposed to know about it, even if I haven't been there myself.
That's the idea. It might seem strange, but it prevents people from playing dumb and trying to claim a property that already belongs to someone else.
Okay, so notice is about making sure everyone is on the same page and there are no surprises.
Exactly. Now, another important concept, priority.
Priority.
It refers to the order in which claims or liens on a property get paid off.
Oh, so if there are multiple claims, it's like figuring out who gets paid first.
You got it. Usually the first claim recorded gets paid first.
So if there's a mortgage and then someone files a lien, the mortgage wins because it was recorded first.
Exactly. Like a race to the courthouse to get that claim in.
Makes sense. This also comes into play with foreclosure, right?
Absolutely. When a property is foreclosed on, the money from the sale is used to pay off those debts, and priority determines who gets paid first.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the guide also talks about the chain of title. What is that?
The chain of title is the history of ownership for a property.
Okay.
It traces ownership back to the original grant from the government and shows all those transfers of ownership over time.
Oh, so it's like a family tree for the property.
I like that.
It shows the lineage.
So how do you actually figure out the chain of title?
That's where the title search comes in. You're examining public records to determine that chain and identify any potential issues.
Sounds like detective work, making sure there are no skeletons in the closet.
Exactly. The title company or attorney then puts together a title abstract.
Okay.
It's basically a summary of all that, and it's given to the buyer and lender.
Okay, so it's like a condensed version of the whole search.
Exactly. Finally, the guide stresses how important a marketable title is.
Marketable title, what's that?
It means the title is free from any issues that would prevent a reasonable buyer from purchasing the property.
So no problems, no red flags.
That's it. Essential for a smooth transaction.
So we covered title, chain of title, title searches, marketable title.
Uh-huh.
Got it. What about when ownership actually changes hands? How does that happen? That's known as acquisition and transfer, and the guide separates it into voluntary and involuntary alienation.
Okay, so voluntary is when someone willingly transfers the property.
Exactly. Selling, gifting, that kind of thing.
And involuntary is when they don't have a choice.
That's it. Foreclosure would be an example of that.
Yeah.
Eminent domain, adverse possession, and escheat, those are also involuntary.
Okay, so voluntary is when I choose to transfer it, and
Yeah.
involuntary is when it's taken from me.
You got it. Now, the guide highlights the role of the deed in this whole process.
The deed, that's the document that says I own the property, right?
That's the one. It officially conveys ownership from the seller to the buyer. And there are different kinds of deeds with different levels of warranties and protections.
So what kind's the best?
A general warranty deed is the gold standard. It gives the buyer the most protection. A quitclaim deed, on the other hand, offers no warranties at all.
So there's a whole hierarchy of deeds, huh? With the general warranty deed being the best for buyers. What makes a deed valid, though? Is it just signing it?
Well, there's a bit more to it than that. It has to be properly executed, delivered, and accepted.
Okay, so executed means signed,
Right.
delivered means given to the buyer,
Uh-huh.
and accepted means they agree to the terms.
Exactly. And of course, you have to record that deed with the county clerk
Right, to make it official.
to provide that constructive notice.
Now, what about easements? Those are always a bit confusing.
Easements give someone the legal right to use someone else's property for a specific purpose.
So like having permission to use part of their land for something.
Exactly. And they can be created in a few different ways. Through a deed, a will.
Even by prescription.
Ah, yes, easement by prescription.
What's that?
Well, that's when someone uses another person's property openly and continuously for a certain amount of time,
Okay.
even if the owner doesn't give them permission.
So it's like squatters' rights for easements.
You could think of it that way, and there are different types too. An easement appurtenant benefits a specific property,
Okay.
while an easement in gross benefits a person or a company.
Can you give me an example of an easement appurtenant?
Sure, imagine you have two properties side by side. One needs access to the road, but the only way to get there is by crossing a bit of the neighbor's land.
Okay.
That's when you'd have an easement appurtenant, giving them the legal right to cross.
Makes sense. What about an easement in gross?
A utility company needing to run power lines across a property.
Okay.
That would be an easement in gross. It benefits the company, not a particular property.
Got it. So easements can really impact how a property can be used.
Absolutely. And they can affect the value too. Now, let's talk about the 4 stages of real estate acquisition.
Okay.
This is a helpful way to think about buying a property.
Breaking it down into steps.
Exactly. First, you gather the facts, understand what your client needs, what they're looking for, their budget.
So doing your research before you even look at property.
Right. You got to understand the market too.
Okay, so gather facts, know your client, understand the market. What's next?
Then you consider options. You've got a list of potential properties. Now you weigh the pros and cons.
So comparing them to see which ones fit best.
That's it. Location, price, conditions, size, everything that matters to your client.
Okay, so we've gathered facts, considered options. What's step 3?
Making the offer. This is where you negotiate the purchase agreement, secure financing.
The exciting part,
Yeah,
but also a little stressful.
it can be. But you're working to make that dream of homeownership a reality.
All right, and the final stage.
Closing the deal. Finalizing that financing, all the documents get signed, and ownership is officially transferred.
That's the big day.
It is the culmination of all that hard work.
Now let's talk about those different types of estates in real estate. Remember we talked about how an estate defines the extent of someone's ownership interest.
That's right. It's all about what it means to actually own a property.
Okay, so remind me, what are the main types of estates?
You have freehold estates, which means you own the property for an indefinite period, and leasehold estates.
Which are, for a limited time.
Exactly. Freehold implies ownership. Leasehold is about possession for a set period.
So freehold is like owning a house, And leasehold is like renting.
You got it. Now, the most common freehold estate, the fee simple estate, that gives the owner the most complete set of rights.
Full ownership.
Full ownership, that's right. You can inherit it, transfer it to others. Now, a life estate is a bit different. It grants ownership only for the lifetime of a specific person.
So their ownership is tied to their life.
Exactly. Once they pass away, the property goes back to the original owner or their heirs.
Interesting. So it's temporary ownership. The guide also mentions some variations like fee simple determinable and fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Those sound a little more complicated.
They can be a bit tricky. Fee simple determinable, that's when ownership is granted, but there's a specific condition attached.
So it's like, you can have this property, BUT.
Exactly. And if they don't meet that condition, ownership automatically goes back to the original grantor.
Okay, so there are strings attached. What about fee simple subject to a condition subsequent?
Similar, but the original owner has to take legal action to get the property back. It's not automatic.
Okay, so there's a difference in how it's enforced.
That's right. Estates can be a bit complex. Now let's get back to involuntary alienation.
Right, that's when ownership is transferred without the owner's consent.
Exactly. The guide talks about foreclosure, eminent domain, adverse possession, and escheat as causes for that.
Okay, let's start with foreclosure. Always a tough one.
It is. It's when the lender takes back the property because the borrower didn't make their mortgage payments.
So they break the agreement, the lender takes the house back.
That's the basic idea. Eminent domain, we talked about that earlier, right? That's when the government takes the property for public use.
Right, but they have to pay fair market value.
They do. Now, adverse possession, that's a little different.
Yeah, how does that work?
It's a legal thing that lets someone acquire ownership just by possessing the property for a certain period.
So if someone squats on my land for long enough, they can take it from me.
It is possible, but there are strict rules. It has to be open and notorious, hostile, continuous, and for a specific amount of time.
Okay, so it's not easy to do.
Not at all. And lastly, escheat. That's when the state takes the property if someone dies without a will and has no heirs.
Right, like the state is the backup plan.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, so that covers involuntary alienation. What about contracts? I know those are super important in real estate.
They're the foundation of everything. Legally binding agreements between parties.
And the guide lists those essential elements of a valid contract.
You need offer and acceptance. One person offers, the other accepts.
Okay.
Then there's consideration, something of value is exchanged. Legal capacity, meaning everyone's legally allowed to enter into the contract.
Right, like they're of legal age.
Exactly. And the contract has to be for a lawful purpose. You can't make a contract to do something illegal.
Makes sense. What about that statute of frauds?
Yes, that requires certain contracts to be in writing to be enforceable.
And real estate contracts are one of those.
They are. No handshake deals when it comes to property.
Got it. So everything needs to be written down black and white.
Absolutely. Now, you also have those TRC promulgated contracts.
Right, what are those again?
Those are standard forms that are used a lot here in Texas.
So they're like pre-approved templates.
That's a good way to put it. They help protect both the buyer and seller and make sure everything's clear.
So everyone knows what they're getting into.
Exactly. They cover things like the property details, the price, closing date, any contingencies.
Oh, contingencies. Those are important. Remind me what those are.
Contingencies are conditions that have to be met before the contract is final.
So like, I'll buy your house, but only if I can get a mortgage.
Exactly. They give both sides some protection.
Makes sense.
Ah.
What about equitable title? That's another term I see here.
Equitable title. That comes up when the buyer and seller have a contract.
Okay.
It basically gives the buyer an interest in the property, even before they have the legal title.
Kind of like a temporary ownership.
You could think of it that way. It protects them between the contract and the actual closing.
Okay, so what if someone backs out of the deal? What happens then?
That's called a breach of contract.
Okay.
One party doesn't do what they agreed to.
So if the buyer can't get a loan or the seller changes their mind.
Both of those are examples of a breach, and it can have legal consequences.
So it's serious business. Is there any way to cancel a contract?
There is. It's called rescission.
Okay, and how does that work?
It can happen if everyone agrees, or a court can order it if one party breached the contract.
So there are ways to get out of it if things go wrong.
There are. Now let's talk about agency relationships in real estate.
Okay, so agency is basically when one person acts on behalf of another.
That's it. You have the agent and the principal.
Okay.
And in real estate, agents represent buyers, sellers, landlords, or tenants.
So there are different kinds of agency relationships.
There are single agency, dual agency, intermediary, brokerage.
Okay, so single agency is when the agent works for only one side.
Exactly, just the buyer or the seller.
So they're solely focused on that one person's interest.
Exactly. Then there's dual agency,
Okay.
where the agent represents both sides.
Wait, isn't that a conflict of interest?
It can be, which is why the agent has to disclose it to everyone and get their consent.
So everyone knows who the agent is working for?
Right. Transparency is crucial. Now, here in Texas, we have intermediary brokerage.
Okay. How is that different?
The broker represents both sides, but the individual agents working for the broker each represent only one.
So it's like a team approach.
Exactly. Now, no matter what type of agency it is, the agent owes certain duties to their clients.
Okay, like what?
Loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care.
Those some pretty serious.
They're fiduciary duties, so the agent has to put their client's interests above their own.
Okay, so always acting in the client's best interest. The guide also mentions minimum services. What are those?
Those are the basic things a broker in Texas has to do for their clients.
So like setting a baseline for service.
Exactly. Answering questions, presenting offers, helping with the closing process.
Making sure brokers are doing their job.
That's right. And remember, the broker is responsible for their agent's actions.
Right, because of that vicarious liability thing.
That's it. So important for brokers to supervise their agents and make sure they're trained properly.
Absolutely. Now let's touch on some of those special topics the guide mentions.
Okay.
What are some of the things covered?
Well, there's community property. That's a big one here in Texas for married couples.
Community property, remind me what that is.
Basically, any property acquired during the marriage is owned equally by both spouses.
So even if only one person is on the deed, they both own it.
That's right. Important to keep in mind when dealing with transactions with married couples. Then there are homestead protections.
Yeah.
Those protect part of a homeowner's equity from creditors.
So they can't lose their home if they have financial trouble.
Exactly. Texas has some pretty strong protections there. And then the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the DTPA,
Okay, what does that cover?
well, it protects consumers from unfair or deceptive practices, including those in real estate.
So if an agent lies about a property or does something shady, I can take legal action.
That's right. It's a good tool for consumers.
Okay, good to know. What about wills and estates?
Wills determine how property is distributed after death.
So making sure everything goes to the right people.
That's it. If you don't have a will, the state decides.
So it's important to have a will.
It is. We also talked about landlord-tenant law earlier.
Right, with leases.
The guide gives you a good overview of the basics for both landlords and tenants.
So all the laws are outlined in the Texas Property Code?
They are. And then there's foreclosure. We touched on that before.
Right, what are the key things to remember about that?
Well, it's a legal process with specific steps.
Okay.
Borrowers have certain rights, and there are alternatives like short sales.
Right, those are when the property is sold for less than the debt.
Exactly. The lender agrees to take a loss to avoid foreclosure.
So it's a compromise.
That's it.
Yeah.
And don't forget about recording statutes. Those are the rules for recording those real estate documents.
Right, like deeds and mortgages to give that constructive notice.
Exactly. And then you have those mechanics and material man's liens.
Those are for construction workers, right?
That's right. They can file a lien against a property if they don't get paid for their work.
Okay, so it protects them.
It does. Now, the Veterans Land Board, that's a fantastic resource for veterans in Texas.
Oh, tell me about that.
They provide financial help for veterans to buy land and homes.
That's amazing. A great benefit for our veterans.
It is. Now, what about homeowners associations?
HOAs, yeah, those can be tricky.
They can, but they also do important things like managing common areas in planned communities.
Right, they enforce those deed restrictions too.
Exactly. They can have a big impact on property values and the quality of life in a neighborhood.
So it's important to know the rules.
It is. And one last concept to remember: equitable interest.
That's the right to a property, even if you don't have the legal title yet.
That's it. Really important to understand that one.
Wow, we've covered a lot today. There's so much to learn about Texas real estate.
There is. It's a complex but rewarding field.
I feel like I've learned a ton. It's been a whirlwind tour, but I feel much more prepared now.
That's what we're here for. Now that you have a taste of what it takes to navigate the world of Texas real estate, what excites you most about this industry? Is it the thrill of closing deals, the challenge of property management, or the satisfaction of helping people find their dream homes? Whatever it is, this is just the start of your journey, and we encourage you to keep exploring.